Shortly after Tina stopped shooting, Abraham Zapruder turned on his camera. To see when the next shot was fired, we'll be looking at extreme blow-ups of the earliest parts of that film. Notice the president dropping his right hand. Shortly after frame 165, we will see a sequence of movements by the President and Mrs. Kennedy, which I believe are quite significant. At this point, Mrs. Kennedy, who would later testify that she was looking to her left when she heard the first noise, begins to turn toward her husband. Like many other witnesses, Mrs. Kennedy was adamant that the first noise didn't sound at all like a gunshot. Also, please pay close attention to President Kennedy's hands, which he has brought to rest together. His fingers at this point are interlaced. At the same time that Mrs. Kennedy begins to react, the President starts to separate his hands, which had been together for only 15 frames, or 5/6 of 1 second. Mrs. Kennedy continues to turn toward her husband. But look at the President's hands now. In particular, look at the fingers of his left hand, which had been interlaced with his right hand. The President raised his right hand before he even separated it from his left, causing him to pull his left hand upward by several inches, and the fingers of his left hand to be splayed and pointing straight up. Before high-resolution versions of the Zapruder film were available to the public, most researchers believed that JFK was smiling in frame 180. But when we zoom in and get a better look at him, I don't think there's much doubt that we're seeing a grimace rather than a smile. In the next clear frame, we see that as he raised his hand, JFK was simultaneously twisting to his right. By frame 193, he has turned more than 90 degrees to his right and is clearly shielding his face with his right hand. Notice also that Mrs. Kennedy has turned completely to her right, exactly as she said she did in response to that first noise. So by this point in time, we seem to have seen two distinct reactions by President Kennedy. Now, if those were caused by gunshots, then the shooter did exactly what we would expect him to do. He fired again, and with exactly the same result. He missed. When I first heard the theory that one shot missed the entire limousine and struck the pavement, I didn't believe it. I mean, how could anybody shoot that badly? But if we look into what is really the only plausible explanation for how this could have happened, it all starts to make sense. Weapons expert Mark White wrote an article for Small Arms Review magazine, which also appeared at the Guns.Connect website. In it, Mr. White discussed problems associated with the use of noise suppressors on rifles. As Mr. White points out, suppressors, also known as silencers, are notorious for causing misfires, because even the tiniest misalignment can cause gunshots to go wildly off course. His article came out 35 years after the assassination, but even then, many silencers were having serious problems. In addition to the problems of misalignment, some suppressors were still using baffles that also caused shots to go astray. Keep in mind that White was talking about professionally manufactured suppressors that were decades more advanced than what was available in 1963, and silencers used by the Mafia were frequently homemade devices which were even less reliable. White, who was writing mainly for the law enforcement community, also pointed out that no enforcement officer in his right mind would ever assemble a rifle on the spot on a call out at a crime scene and expect the weapon to hold at zero. He said it might, but such an occurrence would be an abnormality. Of course, no assassin would risk being spotted carrying a fully assembled rifle and suppressor into Dealey Plaza. He would have had to plan on assembling it after he got there, making his weapon all the more unstable. Folks, if this was any other crime in history, and the shooter missed his target that badly, wouldn't the first suspicion be that the sniper was having a problem with his rifle? But There's an even better reason to believe that a faulty suppressor was used to fire the early shots. Shortly after that last reaction, the president was clearly hit by a bullet. Now, if I'm correct, this was the third shot. The most common belief among researchers in the past is that this was the second. And yet the large majority of witnesses that day said they only heard one early shot and then closely bunched shots at the very end. So, of all the early shots, only one was actually noticed by most witnesses. And most witnesses who described that first audible shot said that it sounded much different than the ones they heard later. Special Agent Roy Kellerman testified that the first sound he heard was similar to a firecracker exploding in the area to the rear of the car. Like the other witnesses, he heard nothing at all following that first noise until the end of the attack, when he heard a flurry of shells come into the car. When our inspector asked him if those final gunshots sounded different from that first sound he heard, he replied, yes, definitely, very much so. Mrs. Connolly first heard a noise which she did not recognize as a gunshot. Then she looked back and saw the president obviously reacting to being hit. She went on to testify that she heard two more shots after that, one of which she mistakenly believed wounded her husband. We'll be talking more about that shortly. Like Mrs. Connolly, Mrs. Kennedy first heard a noise which she did not believe was a gunshot. We'll be talking more about her also. Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood also confirmed that the first shot he heard was different and more like a firecracker than the last shots. Secret Service agent George Hickey, riding in the car behind the president, said that the final two shots he heard were completely different than the first one. Hickey also stated that the first shot sounded like it came from ground level, which suggests that what really made that shot audible was the fact that it shattered when it struck the pavement. Reporter James Underwood described the first noise this way: I thought it was an explosion. I've heard many rifles fired, but it did not sound like a rifle to me. I believe I said to one of the other fellows, it sounds like a giant firecracker. Witness James Tague described that first noise this way: about this time I heard what sounded like a firecracker. Well, a very loud firecracker. It certainly didn't sound like a rifle shot. Texas Governor John Connally, on the other hand, testified that he thought the first shot really did sound like a gunshot. Warren Commissioner Allen Dulles responded, "You and one other happen to be the only witnesses who have indicated that they recognize it as being a rifle shot. Most of the witnesses have indicated they thought it was a backfire. The first shot was a backfire or a firecracker." Okay, let's see if we can make sense out of all this. The limo proceeds to the intersection of Houston and Elm. Just as it appears in front of the Daltex building, the sniper aims at the president's head and fires. But the suppressor on his weapon causes the bullet to go astray and strike the pavement to the right of the limousine. Although not totally silent, the sound was weak enough that it was drowned out by the crowd noise and went unnoticed. A few seconds later he fires again, but the same thing happens, only this time the shot made an audible sound when it hit the pavement, and perhaps because the crowd noise had diminished, it was heard by many of the witnesses. The sniper makes one last try. By now he realizes that his shots are being pulled to the right, so he adjusts, sighting his weapon to the left of the president's head. But he has no way of knowing how to adjust his shot vertically. So instead of hitting the head, his bullet strikes the president in the upper back. But since that shot did not strike the pavement, it was heard by almost no one.